Tom, over the weekend, I'm not sure if you saw, but a friend of ours, a prominent media voice in the Denver community named Mandy Connell, had a bit of a Twitter battle with cancel culture like we talked about last week.
I got to have lunch with Mandy right when she moved to Denver. In fact, I don't even think she had been on the air yet, but she had been connected with my friend Ross Kaminsky.
Right.
And so he put on a big welcoming barbecue at his house when she moved to Denver. And so I got to know her, and I've been, of course, tracking her career on Denver Talk Radio. She's a great voice out there.
And we've gotten to spend a decent amount of time on the air with her, talking about different programs, either Vino Veritas Society itself or related programs that led to this. And I found it interesting after our conversation last week regarding cancel culture and what we called the good versus cancel culture. And Mandy had a group of local politicos, I guess you might call them, some in the media themselves, some who one is a member of the local school board.
As I like to call them sometimes, the progressive mob.
Right,
yeah,
right,
okay.
Exactly. Two people who have not shied away from becoming very controversial over the years among our circles anyway, and they tried to cancel her, and their whole mob, their followers, their friends made a serious attempt to cancel Mandy Connell and her radio show.
Goodness, Dave, clearly she must have done something terrible. She must have committed some heinous, violent, terrible crime.
You want to know how heinous crime she committed? She actually suggested, you're not going to believe this, she actually suggested that children who grow up in a two-parent household have a better chance of success.
Then what?
Than somebody who grows up with a single parent.
Oh, get out of here, Dave. That is so offensive. That hurts the feelings of so many people who set aside all the demographic and criminological and social science research that's been collected over the last 50 years demonstrating that very single truth. That's going to hurt some people's feelings.
Well, this has become a huge part of the cancel culture. And I thought today, if we're going to keep going down this path of the good versus cancel culture, the point she was trying to make was that we can aspire to something greater. We can aspire to good. And this idea that we should cancel aspiration, that we should just cancel anything that might be something people aspire towards because it might make somebody feel bad, just is astounding to me.
Let's put a little more meat on the bones here about Mandy's story, and then we'll go to sort of that bigger topic of what it means to cancel aspiration. So in Mandy's case, I went back and looked at a little bit of that conversation. It all revolves around a young man who is on the Denver Public School District School Board?
Correct.
And
when you say young, he just turned 22.
22 years old. Young. That's a young man in my definition.
Correct.
And he was publicly writing about he's overwhelmed with joy because he's going to be a father. He's going to have a baby.
Right.
And it turns out that the woman whom he impregnated is not his wife. And so Mandy, I read her initial comment, right? It was very loving and caring. She said, and they're not political friends by any stretch of the imagination. But she was saying, right, this is a personal thing. She was saying this is wonderful news and congratulations, and it's one of the great joys in life, becoming a parent, and just gushing with good energy and lots of praise. And she says, I hope you'll at least consider, maybe think about marrying the mother of your child, your soon-to-be mother of your child. Wow, the reactions it just lit up. It was like lighting a stick of dynamite, right? And she's being denounced and called all kinds of names and how dare you? Because she was offering a judgment. She was offering a kind of judgment. She was saying, it's her judgment that when children grow up in a home where their biological parents are married to each other and take care of the kids, right? That's kind of the optimal situation for children. This is not merely, now here's something, this is hard to talk about in a world of progressivism. This is not merely a prejudice. This is not merely a feeling or a perspective. we actually have mountains of data. I'll give one example. Criminologists for decades, people who study crime and criminals, and then they dig into the backgrounds. They want to know why. Why are certain groups of people more likely statistically to commit crimes than others? And criminologists across the board, I mean liberal criminologists, conservative criminologists, all the way across the political spectrum, they agree on this one fact, that the single most important variable for determining the likelihood of incarceration are boys who grew up without fathers around.
Don't tell that to Joe Biden after he signed the 94 crime bill.
More important than anything. I mean, more important than poverty.
Right.
More important than skin color, more important than geography, where you grew, whether you grew up in a tough inner city or a rural community. Number one variable, boys who grow up without any kind of father presence around are many times more likely to commit crime, to be arrested, prosecuted, convicted for crime, to get sent to jail or prison early in their life. I mean, it's just, off the charts. And so you look at that and you think, okay, that's the statistics don't lie. Then it would seem someone who's thinking about what's best for their own children would want to aspire to that. It's not always possible for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes, bad, freaky accidents happen. So people die. A parent might die. Both parents might die from an accident, a disease. Who knows? Also, bad things often happen in marriages. Marriages are really hard to keep together. It's not always possible. But none of that in any way detracts from the goal. What's optimal? What's best?
The point is, we're not saying that if you grow up in a single mother or single father household, you're doomed. We're not saying you're bad. We're not saying this is your fault or anything else of the sort. We're just saying that in more likelihood than not, in all likelihood, you are going to have a higher chance of success if there are two parents. And on top of that, when you go back to all that criminology and when you think about all that criminology, the second phase of this is that those who do grow up in a multi-parent household, in a two-parent household, and at the same time have criminal issues, usually there's something there that the father or the mother is abusive, is in some ways exhibits one of the social pathologies that we've actually attributed to progressivism. And when you think about it in that sense, Mandy was actually commending this young man on the Denver Public School Board. Right? She was saying to him, I don't think you're such a bad person. I think you're a good enough person that child should have you in his life.
That's right.
And he doesn't take it that way. He took it as offense of, how dare you say that my son can't grow up successful if I'm not there.
Well, let's just for a moment, let's back away from this kind of highly charged subject of the personal development of children growing up in different types of settings, different types of household. Let's focus on some things that possibly are maybe less controversial. When we think about a newborn baby coming into the world, and then as that child grows, becomes a toddler, right? Becomes a teenager, eventually going to become an adult. Think about their physical health. I think most people today would agree that there are things that are optimal for the physical health. No guarantees. Bad things can still happen. Accidents still happen. But there are things that are optimal and there are things that are far from optimal. For example, the diet, right? What you feed your babies. If you raise a child on lard, my hunch is, I'm no medical physician, and I don't pretend to be one on podcasts.
Did you stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so we'll take this as for a grain of salt.
That's right. If you fed your child lard and junk food, and that's it, chances are high that your kid's going to start having problems at some point in time, versus feeding them, mixing in some nutritious foods. Get in some fruits and veggies in there, get in some protein, where you can. People would agree with that. That doesn't mean if someone feeds their kids a bunch of garbage, it doesn't mean we hate the kid. No, we don't hate the kid. We're just saying for those parents who want to do what's best for their children, think about their physical health. Maybe when your little toddler is just learning how to walk and he wobbles over to the electrical outlet and he wants to put his finger in it, maybe think about saying, no, don't put your finger in the outlet, move him away, because it's better, right? That's optimal. When they're sticking their fingers in electric sockets, that's not very good. You could also think about the intellectual development of a child. I think most Americans, even most progressive Americans, would agree that it is objectively better to teach your child some things. Teach them some things. Maybe even send them to a school. Maybe send them to the school that
Careful.
Tay Anderson sits on the board of, right? And designs. Send them to school and teach some things. Now, if parents didn't teach their kids something, would we hate the kids? No, we wouldn't hate it. We're just saying to parents, if you love your children and you want your children to have a good shot at life, a good shot at becoming a fully mature, reasonable, self-governing adult who can experience some happiness in life, then teaching your child something, that's a good thing. That's not hating on anyone. That's simply pointing out the obvious truth. There are certain things that are better for children. There are certain things that are better for human beings and other things that are not as good.
And let's be clear. You keep saying, does that mean we hate the kid? Mm-hmm. Not only do we not hate the kid, we don't hate the parents either, right? If the intentions are to get as close as you can to the optimal, to the good, we know how hard that is. We know how hard it is to actually achieve that. And it doesn't mean that you actually hate the parents because they're not achieving perfection. Mm-hmm. The perfect example goes back to what you were talking about with diet for children. Mm-hmm. There is an optimal diet for children that gets their immune system and their metabolic systems developing perfectly over time. Most children will not eat that diet.
Right.
They will starve before they actually eat that diet.
Right.
And so as a parent, you have to have this balance of, I'm going to feed my kid a little bit of this because I know it's really good for them. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to bribe them saying, my 2-year-old, I'm going to bribe them saying, if you eat your broccoli, I'll give you this piece of chocolate at the end of dinner. Right? And I know adults that you have to bribe them to eat their broccoli. So it's not just with children.
It's hard for me to believe because I'm actually a big fan of broccoli. We eat broccoli at home.
I know you do.
3 or 4 times a week. We steam
that's
broccoli.
More than I knew.
We really enjoy it. But you're right. And so the whole model there, right? You take that model of food, of diet, those calculations that the parent is making. Okay, Johnny, you eat this over here, then you'll get the cookie as a treat, something like that. Those calculations are being made in light of a goal. There is a goal. There's that optimal diet up here, and you realize, okay, we can't get there. How close can we get? You strive to get as close as possible, right? And in fact, the whole field of medicine. If you step back and look at medicine, what's the premise of medicine? The premise of medicine is, and here the ancient nerdy Greek in me is going to come out.
Okay.
It's a Platonic ideal of physical health. Maybe no actual human body today is as perfectly healthy as that Platonic ideal. But medicine has this ideal of what physical health is, and that's what allows physicians to diagnose a disease, a pathology, something that is deformed. How would a physician know what a deformed leg is or a deformed arm if they don't have some concept of a healthy leg, a healthy arm, right? They have to have some standard to compare things to.
Yet at the same time, and this goes back to our discussion of central planning versus local individualized help. If the government is going to say, this is what perfect health looks like, they are applying it to people that they don't know, that they can't measure. They are saying that every single person, their target BMI should be X. If you're this height, your weight should be this. But if I go to my doctor and he examines me, he might say, yeah, I know you're this height, but your perfect BMI and your perfect weight would be something different. Yeah. And it's that it just goes to show one more way that central planning doesn't work.
I didn't think this was going to become a podcast about Plato, but it's quickly becoming that. So there's this beautiful discussion within the Republic. Socrates is making this argument that there is this idea of health, of the healthy body, and that's the model that we look at and we aim at as we think about our own health. Mm-hmm. What can I do to improve my health? Well, what does it mean to improve your health? It means to get closer to that ideal, whatever is optimal. And then Socrates points out, but of course, there are endless differences for each individual. He's talking about a trainer. And this is long before the days of, gyms as we know them today. And think of how popular it is to go have your personal trainer.
It's the guy who picks out the stones that you carry from point A to point B.
That's right. So, if you think about the trainers in the gym, that trainer is going to set an exercise schedule for a 22-year-old professional athlete that's very, very different than an exercise schedule for an 80-year-old who's recovering from heart surgery, who's never been very athletic in his life, right? Those are you wouldn't have them doing the same kinds of things. So there's some room there for prudence, for practical judgment. All right, look at the particulars here, look at the particulars there, figure out what kind of medicine, what kind of exercise, what kind of nutrition. But it's all in light of this goal, trying to get individuals closer to that idea of what health means.
Right.
And here we come around to kind of the big general theme of this podcast, and the general theme that you could see within that whole exchange with our friend Mandy, and that is what you described as canceling aspiration, which is kind of synonymous with the idea of canceling goals.
Yeah.
To say, right, because think of what it means to aspire to something better, to something higher. Whether that's for your personal health, you want to get healthier. Whether it's your mind, you say, I want to become smarter. I want to become more intelligent. I want to know more than I know. Morals, I want to improve morally. I want to be a more moral person than I have been in the past. And in all kinds of other ways, right? Businesses might say, we want to be more profitable. A team might want to be more successful. Mm-hmm. An army might want to be more victorious. All of those aspirations assume some kind of goal up here. There has to be some end point you're aiming at. Whether you actually achieve it or not, that is the basis for aspiration. And what's happening here within this expanding progressive cancel culture is really canceling aspiration and canceling goals.
Right.
Saying you can't tell us what the goal is, that this is good, because that's going to hurt people's feelings who didn't achieve that or didn't experience that.
Well, so now, you talked about teams and businesses and individuals and armies. What about governments? What about regimes, societies? We talk about as the foundational idea of the Vino Veritas Society.
Yeah.
This idea that our founders weren't perfect. In 1776, when they wrote those words of the Declaration of Independence, they weren't perfect, but they had this goal. The Declaration was, you hear all the time. I mean, I at least heard growing up, write your goals down. Yeah. Write them down. Put them on a sticky note. Put them on your mirror. Look at them every day. I'm gonna sidetrack just a little bit. I told you yesterday, we were talking a little bit about this, and I told you about a writer named David Goggins. Mm-hmm. David Goggins wrote a book called Can't Hurt Me. And David Goggins became the first person, I think this is the correct, I'm not totally sure about the military, but I know he was a Navy SEAL. Mm-hmm. I know he was an Army Ranger, and I believe it was Air Force paramilitary. Graduated from all three schools. First person ever to do that.
Yeah, impressive.
But when he was in his mid-20s, he had dropped out of the Navy. He used sickle cell as an excuse to get out of the Navy, ballooned up to over 340 pounds, and was sitting around his couch eating horrible food and drinking all the time and everything else. So he went from that to started writing goals down. And he talks about this in his book, where he starts writing everything down and he's putting them on the mirror. And he'd go into the bathroom every morning and he'd read all of his goals and he'd look himself in the eye and said, go get this done. You're going to go do this today.
Yeah.
Right? And it was that drive. The Declaration was very similar. Yeah. The Declaration was our founders saying, this is our goal. This is what we aspire to, and we're going to keep working towards that, and we're going to get there. And Lincoln, I mean, right? You take it to Lincoln. Lincoln said, we need to get closer. This idea of slavery cannot continue. We have to get closer. We can't let slavery expand. That gets us further away from our idea. So we can't let it expand into the new territory. We have to fight a war against this.
So from the founders through Lincoln, right? There's this goal. The goal never changes. The goal is perfect. The goal is beautiful. It's those timeless principles in the Declaration of Independence, which are the basis of the precepts that we have in the Vino Veritas Society. But what does change are the behaviors of individuals change, public policies, constitutions, laws, right? Those things can change. And so there's the founders, there's Lincoln saying, let's change our policies. Let's change our Constitution. Let's get it in line with the goal as best we can.
Let's keep working towards improving.
Yes.
Towards achieving that. And it's an interesting analogy in that when we talk about that story, when we tell people about the Vino Veritas Society, we draw it, right? We say you have the founding down here in 1776, you have the Declaration up here, and they were striving for that goal.
Yep.
And then we took that hard to your left. We took that hard left turn, and when we draw it, we plateau it. Right?
Yeah.
That line goes straight out to the left.
Yeah.
And if that line is going straight out to the left, it's because we're no longer trying to improve.
That's right.
It's a plateau. We're saying, this is good enough. Let's not hurt anybody's feelings. Let's not take anybody down. Let's not make anybody feel bad. And let's stop improving.
I want to make this is a really simple but deeply fundamental and foundational point that is lost on so many of our fellow citizens today. And it's a point that comes shining through in the study of Greek philosophy. And it reminds me also of, remember Barack Obama's theme of hope and change. And I remember as a student of political philosophy thinking how empty, how intellectually and morally vacant that idea of change is.
Right.
Because, and hope too. But especially that word change, nobody wants change. Because what if the change is for the worse? You don't want to change for the a situation deteriorating, a situation getting worse is changing. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants something worse. What they want is improvement, right? And so the idea of change is just neutral on it has nothing to say about whether the change is for the better or the worse. But the idea of improvement means things are getting better.
Right.
To get better, to improve, means there has to be some notion of what's good. There has to be a goal. Otherwise, you don't know if it's improvement or not. When you're working out in the gym, how do you know if you're getting better, if you're getting stronger, if you're getting faster? It's got to be you have to have some kind of goal. I used to bench press this much, and my goal is to bench press this much, right? And if the next day you go in and your bench press has gone up a little bit closer to the goal, you've improved, you're getting closer to the goal. It's impossible to have improvement or the opposite of improvement. It's impossible to have progress or regress without a goal. And yet the kind of nihilistic, relativistic, progressive culture we're in, this culture of canceling everything, including canceling aspirations, canceling goals, what many of our fellow citizens are saying is, well, there is no good. There is no goal. That's just a prejudice. That's just who's to say what the goal is? Well, if we don't have a goal, then there's no way to distinguish between whether we're actually making improvement, whether we're moving forward or moving backward.
There's also the conversation of how you actually improve on anything. And I'll carry your analogy through. If you want to bench press more, it doesn't just mean going in and bench pressing every day. Right? You have to work other muscles. You have to do other things that help stabilize your muscles and different things to improve your bench press.
Yeah.
From the progressive central planning mindset, you're really just putting Band-Aids on things. You're saying, I'm losing my leg. And you say, well, Band-Aids help that, or iodine helps clean wounds. I'm going to pour iodine on it because that's what it does. You're not necessarily helping to improve the overall problem. when we think about health, people with diabetes, we often hear when people have diabetes and they're very, very overweight, a lot of times they lose their legs. And when they lose their legs, it wasn't because there was a problem with their legs.
Right.
It was a problem with their diet. It was a problem with their health. It was a problem due to diabetes.
Right.
We see the same thing. So too often in the progressive mindset, this cancel culture is, this is happening, so we have to just get rid of it.
Yep.
Right? Let's chop the leg off. Let's starve the person, right? Diabetes is killing them. Let's starve them because that way they can't put anything bad in their body anymore.
It's again another reference to ancient philosophy. It's a remedy that's worse than the disease.
Right. And it just keeps feeding and making it worse and worse and worse until now you have somebody who's got both diabetes and is losing their legs and they're starving
And they're
to death.
starving. You know, it's funny. I want to do a shout out here to one of our guardians, Keith Nobles, who reminded me the other day of one of the important lessons offered by the late brilliant economist Walter Williams, who died here just not too long ago.
Yeah.
I met Professor Williams several times, and he was a man with dark black skin, and I'm mentioning that because the study of the economic well-being of blacks in America was a big focus of his research. As a black man, he wanted to know what's been going on throughout American history with black people. And one of the amazing, eye-opening revelations he showed, he compared blacks in America in 1920 to 1990, so a gap of 70 years. And one of the big things separating that, in the 1920s, progressivism was still mostly an idea. Woodrow Wilson had been president, but we had not yet created a big progressive regulatory subsidy administrative state. By 1990, we'd had many decades of that progressivism. And in virtually every measurable way, and he did not shy away from the ugly parts. 1920s, if you were a black family living in Atlanta, Georgia in the 1920s, life was tough, man. This is the peak of Jim Crow. This is when the Ku Klux Klan is a large, powerful organization of domestic terrorism committing rape and arson and murder and all kinds of terrible things. So life was not easy for black people. It was really, really hard. And yet, when you measure things like longevity, life longevity, education, literacy skills, all these measurements, economic mobility, the ability to rise up, whatever economic condition you're born into, to improve your situation economically. In all these ways, blacks were doing better in 1920 in racist Jim Crow era of American history than in 1990 because of all these progressive programs, subsidies, policies, regulatory restrictions had created all these incentives and disincentives that had just wrecked the lives of so many black Americans, and the truth is so many other Americans of all kinds of skin colors and different groups. And there it is right in front of us, right? If we look at that with a goal in mind, and we say the goal is we want to see human beings physically healthy, and we want to see them economically prospering and being productive and improve economic mobility, upward mobility. And we want to see them thinking and learning and using their mind and loving the people close to them, loving life, being happy. We want to see them being happy. If that's the goal, then you would look at this story of progressivism and say, this has been a miserable failure. And I think this is one of the reasons why progressives want to just get rid of the goal. Don't tell me that's the goal, that's good. That's just your prejudice, Dave. That's your perspective, right? Who's to say what's good?
What you're saying about the quality of life or the economic and abilities and everything else with the black family from 1920 to 1990, it shouldn't surprise anybody. Because let's go back to the foundations of progressivism. The foundations of progressivism were in Germany, right?
Yep.
We've talked ad nauseum about progressivism started in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s in Germany.
Yep.
It was the precursor. It was the early study that led to Nazism throughout Germany. And Nazis were a cancel culture too. right? I mean,
Very much.
there's no doubting that Nazis were a cancel culture. The only difference is there was no constitution to stop them. There was no separation of powers. There was no Supreme Court. There was no will of the people, anything else.
Yep.
There was Hitler.
Yep.
And there was the SS. And what did they do? They burned books.
Yep.
Right now we're hearing all about Dr. Seuss being canceled and you can't read Dr. Seuss anymore. The Nazis burned books. What else did the Nazis do? They killed black people. They killed Jews. They killed gays. They killed anybody who wasn't like them.
Most importantly, they killed critics of Nazism. Anyone for any reason who had some questions about the Nazi agenda, who said, I don't quite buy this. I mean, this is one of the reasons for the Nazi regime why the Jews were intrinsically problematic, because the Jews said, we have this God. Here's our God. And it's not the Third Reich. It's not Adolf Hitler. And so from the Nazi point of view, that entire group of people is a problem to be solved. It's a problem to be canceled.
At the time, they were obviously the minority, right? The Nazis were the majority.
Yep.
And we did a whole study several months ago about mob rule and how the Nazis resembled the mob and how many people just followed along because that was what everybody was doing. But it's really no different today. It doesn't have to be – a mob doesn't have to be a majority. And we have a lot of people out there saying you have to cancel white culture. It comes to Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola did a public training, did a training for employees on how to be less white.
Right.
There are education going on in New York City schools telling you here's where you are on a scale of whiteness, and they want you to be a traitor to the white to being white. We're not sitting here as white nationalists. We're not sitting here as white supremacists saying everybody should be white. We're saying no, everybody should be free. Everybody should be valued. Everybody should be looked at equally. We shouldn't be canceling anybody. And this one group of people, these progressives, are out there saying they're no different than the Nazis saying, you Jews who don't believe in us, you need to be canceled. You blacks who don't believe in us, you gays who don't believe in us, you all have to be canceled. We're going to murder 10 million of you plus.
Yep. And if anybody thinks right now, if someone thinks, well, come on, Dave and Tom, the progressive government right now is not building concentration camps and murdering people in large numbers. If anyone thinks that the modes of canceling are not going to intensify, if they think they're not going to get worse, then they're naive. They're fools. Of course they're going to get worse because that chorus of progressive cancelers is growing and growing and growing. And they're reinforcing their own moral superiority, right? We have the absolute truth. We progressives who deny there's truth. We have the absolute truth, and anyone who rejects us, who opposes us, right, must be canceled. With that kind of moral confidence, the persecution becomes increasingly intense.
You know, it's also interesting that, and we don't usually go into an international affairs, international foreign policy conversation on these, but it's interesting to see the transition from Trump to Biden on the treatment of China. And for anybody who thinks, what the Nazis did or the way they canceled people isn't happening, there are 3 million Uyghurs in China right now in concentration camps who would beg to differ.
Right.
And Joe Biden is coddling China.
That's right.
Joe Biden is trying to make amends with China and trying to say, I'm sorry that Trump did all of these horrible things because anything Trump did was bad. And I hold Trump to the same standard. Trump didn't do enough either.
Well, so Biden's foreign policy, you're right. He's coddling international, cancelers who are throwing people in concentration camps. Let's call them what they are. They're concentration camps.
And he's justifying it. He's justifying it as that's their culture.
Yeah, and at the same time, he's trying to facilitate that culture here.
Right.
The Biden administration has launched this big effort in the name of combating domestic terrorism, but it's this very loose, willy-nilly definition of domestic terrorism that includes critics of the regime, critics of the government. Dave, I'm telling you, you and I, sitting right here, having the kind of conversations, we very likely fall within their definition of domestic terrorists.
It's hard not to see similarities to the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
It's hard not to see the similarities of what's going on right now to Hitler and FDR.
Yeah.
And I know there are so many people out there, all these progressives who think FDR was the greatest president we've ever had and all of these things, but FDR was breeding the same type of hate then. And I want to remind everybody of this because people, our members, I find get it, but everybody needs to be reminded of this constantly. FDR, this whole cancel culture started in 1944 with a speech from FDR. This whole cancel culture of conservative ideas, of the conservative movement, before the conservative movement even existed.
Let's point people. That was his, I think what you're referring to was his State of the Union address.
Correct.
Which was his last big national speech. At the end of 1944, he would die just a few months later in 1945. And at the very end of that speech, he makes it very clear. He says, we've after 4 administrations, we've created all these big, expansive New Deal government programs and policies and regulatory agencies, and we've expanded the grip, the control of the federal government over the lives of Americans in many ways. And he thinks that's wonderful. That's great. That's what progressivism is all about, control. And he says, this is in 1944. Think of what's going on in the world, right? World War II.
Yep.
And he says, if those damn conservatives are victorious here in the United States, if they win elections, if they take back the presidency and take back control of Congress, then I'm quoting him, even though we will have beat fascism or defeated fascism on battlefields abroad, that fascism will be victorious here in the United States. Now, what kind of fascism were we beating abroad? Nazism, Nazi fascism. He's basically saying if you're a conservative in the United States and you disagree with these big government programs, unconstitutional, unjust, corrupt-filled, wasteful programs, you're a Nazi. You're a fascist. And this kind of brings me to a big point I wanted to make in all this is the utter confusion, the miserable inconsistency and contradiction at the heart of progressive thought. And I want to back up and offer kind of a philosophic framework here. There were two philosophic observers who differed in many ways, but they have some fascinating similarities. Alexis de Tocqueville, who is French-born, he traveled throughout the early United States in the late 1820s and 1830s, that Jackson, when Andrew Jackson was president. And a German thinker, Friedrich Nietzsche, sort of the father of postmodern nihilism. And both of them made this observation. They agreed on this. The ancient world, the ancient way of looking at things, especially human things, tended to be hierarchical. There's a view that certain things are superior, are better, certain things are worse. Certain things are noble and praiseworthy, certain things are ignoble. Courage is not merely different than cowardice. Courage is higher. We praise courage. We give people medals when they demonstrate, unusual kinds of acts of courage. Cowardice is low and debased. It's shameful. It's something to be embarrassed of. And so the world was kind of hierarchical. Virtue is high and is worth aspiring to. Vice is base and ignoble. And what happens in the modern world as this spirit of egalitarianism spreads, this idea of progressive egalitarianism that we should all be the same in many fundamental ways, and there really is no good to aspire to. It makes it impossible to see anything as ultimately good. That leveling, that modern progressive relativistic leveling, say there is no hierarchy, there is no objective good, there's just different perspectives and prejudices. That leads to progressives saying, don't judge, right? Progressives denounce judgmentalism, and what they really mean by that is moral judgmentalism. Don't make moral judgments about other people. And here's the confusion. That statement itself is a judgment, right? They're making a judgment that it's wrong. They're making a moral judgment.
Yeah.
It's morally wrong to be judgmental.
Sure.
And if you scratch at that just a little, just scratch the surface a tiny little bit, okay, Mr. Progressive, you just said it's morally wrong to be judgmental. Wrong. Where does this wrong come from? This idea of that must mean something's right. If there's a wrong, there has to be a right. What's the basis of right and wrong when you yourself said there is no right and wrong, there's just perspectives? And that confusion now has contaminated. It's like a cancer. It's like a virus. It has contaminated our public discussion, our public policy. The very people who will say, don't judge, there's no right and wrong, those same people want to use government power to control how you should live your life and how you should not live your life. You want to smoke? By golly, we're going to pass a public policy. You're not smoking in any public spaces or in any restaurants or bars or things because we said it's bad. Well, wait a minute, you progressives. You just said there is no objective right or wrong or good or bad. Are you saying that the person who chooses to smoke makes that life choice, has that prejudice, has that preference, is somehow wrong? Right? And they can't.
And who's to decide?
And who's to decide? And they can't think or speak their way out of this contradiction. No. So usually the response is anger, some kind of anger or frustration or mockery or ridicule.
I haven't told this story, and I didn't want to go there, but this happened to me the other day. Just in related, what you're talking about has huge implications on how we've handled the coronavirus situation, right? I mean, this idea of government controlling how we handle the coronavirus as opposed to us being free to make decisions and go to our doctors and nobody necessarily judging each other and everything else. I mean, a progressive would say you can't judge that person,
right?
But we're right in this case, so we're going to judge you now.
We're going to judge.
and I've had this experience now 2 or 3 times at my office where I go to get on an elevator and this guy walks in. And it's the same guy every time. He was outside smoking a cigarette right before.
Okay.
He's easily 200 pounds overweight.
Okay.
I mean, look, none of us are in perfect health.
Yeah.
COVID has not been good for my gym regimen. I'm not criticizing anybody, but this guy is
not a small man.
100 pounds overweight.
Okay.
You can see the stains from the cigarettes in his gray beard.
Okay.
That's sticking out from his mask. And he refused to get on the elevator with me because I didn't have a mask on.
Ah.
And not only did he refuse, he criticized me. He said, I wouldn't get on an elevator with you. You're bad. You said, I didn't listen, right. But he said something to that.
He made a judgment.
Extent. He made a judgment on me.
Yep.
And I'm sitting there thinking, you were just outside smoking a cigarette. Mm-hmm. You clearly don't eat healthy. I'm your biggest concern. This idea of we judge what we think is as progressives, that what we think is appropriate. And it doesn't matter. Anything else doesn't matter.
Yep.
You can't judge us for the things that we do. But if we deem this to be inappropriate, and again, that's what the Nazis did.
Yep.
That's what Adolf Hitler did. He said, you Jews, you over there, you are not up to par with us, and you have to be canceled.
It's like a little game, and our friend Mandy was caught up in this game, right? The game is we progressives are going to judge. We're going to judge Mandy. Mm-hmm. We're going to judge Dave for not wearing his mask, and we're going to judge lots of other. We're also going to judge the smoker, right? We're going to make lots of moral judgments about what it means to be good and bad. Until we hear someone make a judgment we don't like. When Mandy makes a judgment, she said, it is better for kids to have both parents there and in a loving, good, healthy marriage. That's good. She made a judgment. Then instantly the progressives switched to don't judge. There is no right and wrong. There is no objective standard of good and bad, good and evil. Doesn't exist. Don't do that. And so they switch back and forth between these two modes which are incompatible with each other. Non-judgmentalism This is one of the important lessons I learned from my teacher, Harry Newman. Harry Newman was this rather obscure academic, didn't write famous books, wasn't out there shaping the academic landscape, but he was a tremendous classroom teacher. And he was, in my judgment, my opinion, he was the greatest student of Nietzsche. He taught these graduate seminars on Nietzsche, and I swear he had imbibed Nietzsche. And what he demonstrated is non-judgmentalism really is nihilism. That means to truly be non-judgmental means to have no notion of good and no notion of bad. It is to love nothing, to hate nothing, because there's no reason to make a preference about anything. So progressives will jump into that nihilistic mode when it's convenient. There's no right and wrong. Don't judge. It's all just a perspective or a prejudice until they see something they don't like. And then they start judging, and to be judging is to be a moralist, right? You can't help but be a moralist when you're making a judgment. Every judgment, moral judgment, is based on some idea of right or wrong, whether it's a correct idea or not. And this goes to this whole notion of, you've been emphasizing when government makes judgment in terms of its policies. There are two kinds of policies that government can make. One are matters that are morally neutral. And these are not common policies. Say the decision whether people are going to drive on the right-hand or left-hand side of the road, right? There's no moral. That's a morally neutral question. It's just we got to pick one so that we don't run into each other. But there's nothing superior about the left or the right-hand side of the road.
And you do have to make it a law, right? These are the things that you have to make a law so that everybody does it the same way. Car manufacturers have to know that law is going to last because they build their cars differently. And if the thought of, okay, we're going to build a bunch of cars to be driven on the right side of the road, and then all of a sudden the country switches, then what do we do?
And if you and I just have different views, and I want to drive on the right-hand side of the road, and you want to drive on the left-hand side of the road, and we're driving at the same place at the same time, we're going to run into each other, right? Because we're on the same side of the road. So there are those kind of morally neutral policies, which are uncommon, infrequent. Most policies that government makes are based on some moral judgment. A policy that criminalizes murder, right? It's criminalizing murder because the premise is murder's a heinous wrong. It's an injustice. Therefore, we're going to make this law.
Dare we say it's objectively true that murder is wrong?
Right. And even things like regulations are attempts to legislate morality. When we pass a regulation that says restaurants can't serve rancid meat, there's a moral judgment as the premise, right? It's bad, it's wrong for a customer to sit down thinking he's getting a nutritious meal, and in fact he's getting, rancid or poisoned or somehow unhealthy food to eat. There's a moral premise there. And so all these regulations and policies that progressives want to push, including the masks mandates, right, and the closing of businesses and all these COVID-related things, they're all efforts to legislate morality, to take a moral judgment and put it into law, put it into a regulation, somehow use government power to enforce a moral judgment. And then in the very next breath, progressives are explaining how there is no morality. There's no right and wrong.
Right.
And in a way, that's the deep philosophic confusion that reverberates around in all the conversations that we have in the public space today.
But there's a sense to that from within their own perspective, and this is why it's important to understand their perspective and understand their philosophy and understand the foundations of progressivism. The same way that it was important for Harry Newman to explore and understand nihilism. It didn't make him a nihilist. It means that you should explore and understand Nietzsche. You should understand Marx. You should understand the foundations of progressivism in the same way.
Dave, let me tell you a story about Harry Newman that kind of it is one of my favorite stories, and I so adored him as one of my teachers. So he was this lifelong teacher of Nietzsche, and he would present himself as a nihilist. And after spending years studying with him, he was on my doctoral dissertation committee. I became convinced that he was the greatest living moralist. In fact, in the acknowledgments in my Lincoln book, that's what I called him. I called Professor Harry Newman the greatest living moralist because he confronted people with raw, naked nihilism and showed not only how unattractive it is, how impossible it is. And in that sense, he was teaching them, if you're going to be a human being, you're going to be a moralist of one kind or another. The work is to figure out what truly is good. And this example demonstrates this technique. In 1964, he was a newly minted PhD, first-time professor out at the Claremont colleges. He taught at Scripps College. And right after the Kent State shootings, remember this is the age of all these protests, especially on college campuses against the Vietnam War. The Democrats, of course, in the White House at that time were ramping up, sending more and more troops over there, and students were protesting. And at Kent State in Ohio, they called in the National Guard. And here you have these rowdy students throwing rocks and yelling, and the guards opened fire.
Right.
And they shot and killed some students. And out in California, tensions and violence was escalating. Some buildings had been set on fire by protesting students. The worst thing, there was a package bomb that a secretary didn't know what it was and went and opened it, and it like mutilated her, blew her arms off. I mean, it was terrible. And so they called an emergency faculty meeting of all the Claremont colleges on a Saturday morning to talk about what are we going to do about this problem. They didn't want Kent State happening there. They didn't want soldiers coming and shooting students. And in the midst of that, you can imagine, right, the panic and the desperation and the fear. Harry Newman stands up and he looks around. He's a young professor, just been hired. He says, it's a strange thing. All of you are talking as if it's bad for soldiers to shoot our students. And yet, I know many of you go and teach nihilism in your classes. You spend, as English professors and philosophy professors and history professors and sociology professors and political science professors, one way or another, you teach your students there is no right and wrong. There are just prejudices, perspectives. There's no objective moral truth. So if you're right, if there's no objective moral truth, why should any of us care if soldiers come and shoot our students? Now, immediately, they all thought he was crazy, called him names, dismissed him. But of course, his simple question cut to the heart of the matter. He was absolutely right to ask that question.
This goes to the similar question you ask quite often. If you're a moral relativist, do you also decry the 9/11 attacks?
Right.
Was it wrong to do that? If it was not wrong to do that, then there is no right or wrong. But if you agree that it was wrong to do that, and most people do, then you're agreeing that there are moral objective truths in this world, and that no one has a right to kill one another. And it's amazing how people can compartmentalize in their own head these ideas of, well, I know this is true, but I'm going to tell you there's no truth.
Right.
And that's the whole crux of this entire discussion.
Well, this was my big takeaway from over a decade spent with Professor Harry Newman. And his name is a little unusual. His last name is Neumann. Right. Harry Newman. My big takeaway was that nobody is really a nihilist. They're not. They can talk about it. They can advocate for nihilism. They can insist there's no right and wrong, but just scratch them a little bit. Just push them a little bit on topics they care about, and very quickly the inner moralist comes out, and they're going to tell you what they think is right and what they think is wrong. And so ultimately, if we're all moralists, if we all really do believe there's something that is good, something that is desirable and praiseworthy, something that is the opposite, then the real question that should interest us as intelligent thinking human beings is, what is the good?
Right.
And that's the main question that the ancient Greek thinkers raised. It's the main question all intelligent people raise. And it cuts to the heart of what we're doing at the Vino Veritas Society. We have 6 precepts. And the very first one, the very number one,
right.
Truth. The idea that there is objective truth, especially moral truth, that there can be moral goals, there can be a moral good that is objectively true, and once we understand it, we should aspire to it.
It makes the thought process fairly simple. It makes the analysis fairly simple. If you understand what the foundational moral objective truths are in this world, creating those hierarchies is just based on applying those moral objective truths.
That's right.
And the Declaration, our founding fathers, going back to that part of this conversation, they laid it out for us. They told us what those truths are. They told us that all men are created equal. They told all men that we all have equal individual natural rights.
Yep.
Those ideas, those are moral objective truths. And if you just base everything on that, you can determine the hierarchy, and it's all pretty simple from there.
And so here's where we are today, Dave. We have an expanding class of progressives out there trying to cancel people, cancel the whole cancel culture. They're trying to cancel aspiration. They're trying to cancel goals. And to push back against that, to defeat that terrible, miserable effort, is the Vino Veritas Society. And we're coming along reminding our fellow citizens there's truth. There's objective moral truth. There are good things that are worth aspiring to. And we're going to remind people what they should be aspiring to and how to do that in our work, which is why we need guardians of the American founding.
We're not just here to remind and inspire. We're here to guard those ideas. We're here to remind people that we are the guardians of those ideas, and we will not let them go away, that we will not let them perish.
Thus our motto, no sumos custodes. Till next time.
No sumos custodes.